Welcome to the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. I'm Sean Aylmer. The pace of growth of the Australian economy is slowing, and considering interest rates were hiked again this week, it's likely to keep going in that direction. So, are we heading towards a recession? And where is the economy up to? Cherelle Murphy is the EY Oceania Chief Economist. Cherelle, welcome back to Fear and Greed.
Thank you. Very nice to be here.
What is going on? We're having higher interest rates. We've got clearly a slowing in the economy. Households aren't spending as much, or at least the pace of spending has slowed appreciably. What's going on, Cherelle?
I think we're at that really ugly point in the business cycle. And by that, I mean, we're seeing growth fall, but prices and labor costs not falling. So we're kind of experiencing the fall from the Reserve Bank's deliberate attempts to slow the economy down, but it's not yet worked in terms of giving downward pressure on inflation. So we're sort of at the change point where growth has slowed, hasn't yet hit inflation, which means that everything is kind of ugly.
It sure is. I mean, the GDP data from yesterday, the economy grew by just 0.2% in March. That was below most economists' forecasts, though not hugely below. I think the consensus was 0.3%. Did it surprise you, and why are we slowing so much, or why was the number so low?
Yeah, it was a low number. And if you look at it on a per capita basis, it's even worse. That actually fell 0.2%. So that means that if it hadn't been for strong net overseas migration, including with the international students returning, then GDP would actually have contracted. The net exports numbers were actually a detraction from growth this time around. And that's not necessarily all a bad news story, as not as bad as it sounds, because a lot of that was because we were importing more products. So cars and mobile phones were mentioned by the ABS. So in some ways, that is actually an indication of ongoing spending, but it just because it's imports that can pull down that GDP number. So that was probably part of it. As you say, though, also the consumption numbers overall were slower, and we did start to see a pullback, particularly in the discretionary type consumption. Although I will note that restaurant meals and transport still running fairly strongly. So these are categories that are just not showing many signs of contracting quickly. So there was a few things in there that resulted in that slower response.
Okay, so given the ugliness of the situation, I think that was the word you used, wasn't it? The ugly part of the business cycle.
It was.
Will we avoid a recession, or are we headed for one?
It's a tricky one. I'm wondering what the safe word is at this point. It's a tricky one.
Oh, what a great reference to one of our old podcasts.
I know. I was, yeah. Anyway, it does suggest that the economy is going downhill. And does it avoid a recession? Well, I think it's more difficult to avoid a recession than it's been in the past, because the Reserve Bank has had to put up interest rates perhaps a little higher than it previously anticipated. And it's doing that because inflation is not falling as fast as it thought. So in other words, that narrow path that we keep hearing about is getting narrower. Or as I said during the week, it's akin to landing an A380 on an aircraft carrier. It's extraordinarily difficult to do, maybe even impossible. And by that I mean, we've got shifting global headwinds. We've got demand that has to sort of come down enough, but not too much to push us into recession and push unemployment up, and an inflation target which still feels quite a long way away. So all these things combined means it is very possible that we fall into a recession. But we should also keep in mind that the RBA can quickly reverse its decisions on interest rates. So if it saw inflation quickly start to move down as the economy moved into a recessionary position, it can drop rates and stimulate the economy again and hopefully get us out of it quite quickly.
Stay with me, Cherelle. We'll be back in a minute. I'm speaking to Cherelle Murphy, EY Oceania Chief Economist. A couple of the words that we hear lots about in economics at the moment, one's inflation, the other's productivity. Let's start with inflation. The reason the bank is raising rates is to reduce inflation, and you've mentioned it a few times in the past few minutes. Why isn't inflation coming down when we are seeing households certainly spending less?
Inflation is high because service prices are running strongly. Goods prices are actually starting to either fall or rise at a slower pace. And that tends to be a lot of things that we import from overseas. It might be petrol, might be some equipment, mobile phones, that sort of thing. So that part of the equation is looking okay, but it's those service prices that are starting to or continuing to rise quite quickly. So things like a trip to the hairdresser or restaurant meals or holidays at local destinations. These things are all rising in price because people are demanding them. And that's really where the Reserve Bank is most concerned. And it is trying to take away that discretionary dollar from the household sector so that there is less spending in those areas, and that means that there's less inclination for prices to rise.
Okay. Productivity. What did the GDP figures from yesterday, the national accounts figures from yesterday, say about productivity?
It was pretty horrendous. It did show a big fall in productivity growth, around about 4.5% over the last year. That is very soft and shows that essentially employers are having to not only pay higher wages, but on average across the economy, they're getting less out of their workers as well. So it means the effective cost of employment to employers is rising very sharply. We call that the unit labor costs. So it's bad news for inflation, unfortunately. Of course, it's bad news for the economy because falling productivity means that the size of the economy doesn't grow as quickly, income doesn't grow as quickly, and we simply can't afford all the things that we would like. So unfortunately, pretty bad news in there. There's probably a little bit of pandemic impact in there, and there may even be some impact from the floods activity last year, which plays around with the numbers a little bit by keeping employment lumpy. So there is some impact there, and those should be temporary. So that's the good news. It may fade. But nevertheless, productivity growth is either very slow or falling, and that's not welcome.
One thing about economists, Cherelle, is that whenever you have got some good news, there's always a but. So far, this discussion has been bad news, but surely there's a but. Surely there's something good on the horizon.
There is, and I'm glad you asked that, Sean, because as I've been going through the numbers, been quite surprised by these data today because there are lots of different stories in there. There is that falling productivity and falling growth story, but business investment continues to be actually pretty good. So commodity producers, and by that I mean both hard commodity producers like the iron ore miners, etc., as well as agricultural producers are spending more. They are actually lifting their investment in equipment. Infrastructure spending continues to rise as well. Now, again, there are good and bad bits about that. It can be inflationary, but at the same time, we are seeing a lot of building of roads, infrastructure, tunnels, as we all know, or at least those of us who live in the big cities would know.
Yeah. Okay, so wrapping this up, not a great period going forward for the economy. We, as you put it, are trying to land an A380, or the Reserve Bank is trying to land an A380 on a carrier. What about interest rates? Do you think there's much further to go on them?
I think that because the reasons that the Reserve Bank pointed to when it lifted interest rates on Tuesday are becoming more intense. In other words, there are more pressures on inflation. It certainly suggests to me that they're feeling like more rate hikes are likely. It may come as soon as July. I wouldn't necessarily guarantee that, but they're certainly worried about the low productivity, high wages, high services costs, and all these things are contributing to that upward pressure, which they feel like they really need to act against.
Cherelle, it's been a bit of a dismal morning, really, hasn't it? This hasn't been the most uplifting conversation I've had with you over the years.
I'm not having a lot of uplifting conversations at the moment with clients either, Sean. I'm afraid it's a dismal science after all.
It is indeed. Cherelle, thank you for talking to Fear and Greed.
My pleasure. Thank you.
That was Cherelle Murphy, EY Oceania Chief Economist. This is the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. Join us every morning for the full episode of Fear and Greed, Australia's most popular business podcast. I'm Sean Aylmer. Enjoy your day.